AI creates problems, right? The threat landscape, the attacker volume and velocity, the number of findings, et cetera, is all being driven by AI.
I think there's a real economic dynamic here. Like we're making money creating demand and then we're making money solving demand.
All these things aside, it's the downstream practitioners and organizations that rely on this data that, kind of suffer in the end, right?
The sad part is, from a national security perspective, is this aspect and these challenges between agencies actually have led to defenders being impacted negatively.
While the public infrastructure meant to kind of coordinate all of it, like NVD and so on, remains underfunded and the backlogs are problematic, what worries you the most, and kind of where do you things need to go to try to improve this?
I think things have to get worse, and there has to be more pain in order for this to get fixed.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined, or I should say rejoined, by my friend Patrick Garrity, who's been on several times at this point. He's one of the top folks I follow for all things vulnerability management and everything therein. But Pat, for folks that don't know you, can you tell us a bit about your background and the team you're with?
Yeah, so I work at Vulnerabilities. I'm a security researcher, operate a team of few people. We do coordinated vuln disclosure, we do CVE tracking, we correlate threat intelligence, do a bunch of vuln enrichment. So yeah, kind of living firsthand all the fun different experiences around vulnerability databases. And
Yeah, I feel like we're in this era where vulnerability management is cool again. It feels like,
yeah.
it was this thing that everyone dreaded and hated, and it was a pain in the butt, and it still is, but now it's like a hot
worse.
topic.
But it is funny. Like I think, we met probably 2023. In 2022, when I switched to going to work for Nucleus and a VM company, all my friends were like, "Why would you ever work in VM? Nobody cares. Nobody cares about it." And now it's like the latest and greatest in security, mostly because threat actors are using it for initial access, exploits, stuff like that. Like they change their tactics, but the attention flows to wherever the attacker goes. Oh,
Yeah,
we should coin that.
that was smooth. It's not like you planned that one, but no, I mean, it's to your point. It's like it's the number one exploitation vector. Look at DBIR; it's like twice as high as the second one almost. AI has added a whole level of complexity and chaos to it. So you kind of took me to my first question I had for you today. We'll dive into all the AI stuff, vulnerability disclosure, and so on. But you've spent this last decade, it seems like, in security companies like Duo, Census, Nucleus, VulnCheck, and you've become one of the people, including myself, that in the industry we watch for vulnerability data. What convinced you that this is what you should be, building your career around and doing your public body of work around?
Yeah, I mean, I just like solving different problems. So I go and work for, different cyber companies at times for a multitude of reasons. And yeah, I ended up at a VM company, and I kind of joked, but everyone made fun of me because they're like, yeah, at the time in 2022, people were like, well, Rapid7, Tenable, and Qualys have been doing this for a decade, so like, there's no reason to get into VM. And I think that largely was the reality, is most people did their VM with, three different tools, but ultimately, like with the shift of cloud and DevSecOps and AppSec and all that fun stuff, naturally a lot of new requirements arise, and now AI stuff. So, yeah, I think the research side, I got interested in known exploited vulnerabilities. Kind of fixated on that a bit, with SysACEV. And then, we're discovering other evidence of exploitation. So naturally, just kept on researching, and then ended up, fortunate enough to like really spend time in the vulnerability space, in threat intel space. And I think one of the biggest things was everything was an Excel spreadsheet. So like, I'm a very visual person. Most people are visual people. But naturally, Excel or JSON, or some other form of data. But like, how do you actually extract information that's useful for defenders and for executives to help explain, hey, there's a problem here, we need to do something about it, and then what do they actually do? So that, that's where like my interest is really lied, is like translating information so like the broader market can understand what's going on. And then naturally that ties into like government, bureaucracy of like different programs that we can talk about. But yeah, it's fascinating once you kind of get into the ecosystem. It's very niche, but people have been working on this stuff for decades.
Yeah, you've done a great job. To your point about visualizations, is like, I would write 2,500 word articles, and then you would put out a picture, and I'm like, that. Just look at his picture. That basically says what I was trying to say with a lot
We
less
have
words.
short attention spans these days, right?
Yeah. But you've also turned that into long form research and analysis with VulnCheck, like coupling your visualizations with kind of breaking down what this means and the key takeaways for practitioners. Like, it's been super cool to watch the evolution of your work, and I always learn so much, and I share it all the time. And speaking of government bureaucracies and programs, for anyone that tuned out the NIST National Vulnerability Database saga, the NVD saga, give us the honest state of it today. We've talked about this before in the past. Like, the database went into a slow motion in early 2024, some contractual issues, the backlog surged and never really got cleared up. What does the NVD actually look like now? And, what what quietly breaks downstream when it stops enriching CVEs?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I've always advocated for public goods and public sources, NIST MVD being an important one. But yeah, I think the latest report kind of provided some realities and insight into like, for those of us that have been tracking what really went on, which was essentially like CISA stopped funding NIST MVD. That's kind of in the footnotes of the report. I think that report is just focused on NIST MVD. And naturally there's a larger ecosystem with CVE program and then CISA funding the CVE program as well, and then CISA coming in and doing enrichment themselves with full enrichment and tying that in after they stop funding NIST MVD that we know now for fact, and I think NIST lost half their funding at that time. And so, yeah, I think like it does highlight like they do acknowledge like lack of transparency was a really big problem. And then they're like, oh, there's a backlog, we're going to get to it. And essentially the report says like, oh, there was actually no plan to get to the backlog, which is kind of what the data shows. So I don't think anything's like super surprising. To me, I think like if you are in vulnerability management, or if you're interested in how things work, but naturally, like I think it's also important people understand like NIST MVD doesn't create a CVE, like CVE numbering authorities do, and that's the CVE program. And then naturally, NIST MVD gets it and they add enrichment, they kind of validate information. And that's where the issues have lied over the last 2 years. And so, yeah, there's still processing. I think there's an acknowledgement now, like there's resource constraints and then there's duplicate effort between them and CISA, which is rather silly, from my opinion. Like NIST, MVD, CISA, like government entities, like obviously they had a tough time coordinating, considered CISA pulled funding from them. And I think the report highlights, hey, NIST hasn't coordinated with CISA, but like that report didn't go into, CISA's responsibility either. And so I think, there's a lot of mutual issues. And then naturally we saw like the defunding scare with MITRE. I don't like to get into conspiracies, but like, hey, maybe that was actually real and they were trying to take that in-house. Like I think those could be potential realities of like why the situations ended like they did. And then I think on top of that, I don't like to get into politics, but you had changes in administration. So naturally, like people might have changed priorities. So I think those are all, kind of realities from a report perspective. The sad part is, from a national security perspective, is this aspect and these challenges between agencies actually have led to defenders being impacted negatively.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. It's like, politics and priorities aside, like, or even conspiracies, as you put it in some of those cases, like, administration changes in priorities, competing interest, and who's going to run it, who's going to fund it, all these things aside, it's the downstream practitioners and organizations that rely on this data that, kind of suffer in the end, right?
Yeah, and I think the aspect too, from a perspective of like, well, this is only for government anyway. It's not for everyone. It's like you've operated it for everyone for like 25 years. Like that aspect and dynamic. And to be fair, it's like, yeah, I also work for a commercial intel company, and we do vulnerability management stuff, so there's commercial opportunities that arise out of that as well. But generally, I think like the basic aspects of what NIST NVD has provided so long, like it's a good thing as a public good, is my perspective, on that as well. And I think I think the aspect is moving forward, like that program has limitations. They are adjusting to those limitations, which means, they're stepping down some from different aspects of enrichment and prioritizing the things that matter most. So, that's pretty logical, from my perspective. And then I think the other thing is like there is other, stuff in the works, as well from I think a funding perspective. So, that can be promising, to help from a resource perspective. And then on the commercial side, like for me, we're already doing CPE enrichment, which helps identify vendors, products, and vulnerabilities. And we provide a version of NIST MVD with those enrichments, but always looking for ways that we can continue to expand on that, both on the community side and then, of course, doing that on the commercial side for our customers too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you talked about the interagency collaboration and coordination challenges there. First off, let me say that the public good thing, I just listened to a testimony about AI and cybersecurity from Department of Homeland Security, and a big part of the testimonies there were that public entities, critical infrastructure providers, SMBs, et cetera, shouldn't be left to fend for themselves. Is like kind of
Yeah.
and then like, well, NVD's now saying, well, you're on your own. Like this isn't for a government anyways. All right. So who's
Yeah.
going to provide that intel? And then also, I want to ask you this. You might have seen the AI executive order that came out this week, and if not, it basically sets a precedent where it's going to establish a clearinghouse around AI discovered vulnerabilities for prioritization, validation, and so on, with frontier labs and researchers and stuff. How do you see that playing out, given that we're talking about how problematic these interagency collaborations already are for things like NVD? So now you want to stamp a kind of this new clearinghouse for vulnerability discovery, reporting, disclosure. Like, how is that going to work when the one that already exists is kind of buckling?
Yeah, I didn't really know how to react because it's like, well, we already have a vulnerability database, right? So like different clearinghouse vulnerabilities for AI discovered vulnerabilities. I think people have good intentions. A lot of times, also a lot of people, don't have the full picture that might be writing these things. And so I don't know. Anytime there's new vuln data, I like it. It's more things to collect and more things to help aggregate and get visibility into. So, that's natural from my perspective. But it's hard to understand what this is until it happens. I think that's common with executive orders, like, hey, go do something, and then like we'll learn what something is. And that's not only in the U.S. Like I think like NIST EUVD is reflective of that, and then NIST CRA. It's like, yeah, we still have yet to see what we know what the CRA is, but how does it work in practice? And what is it? And then the other thing I think you hone in on a lot is like, well, it's also optional. So are people actually going to do anything and participate? I think there's a lot of hype around AI, so naturally, like, yeah, you're probably going to get some people to participate. Might turn into more of a marketing effort, that I've seen a lot of times of like, hey, we're competing to prove we're the best. Ultimately, like that's good too if it's ending up helping defenders get visibility into more vulnerabilities. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it evolves too. And interesting, it seems like it's going to fall underneath Treasury rather than CISA or NSA, which is also kind of strange.
Yeah, we need more competition in the government for bold stuff.
Yeah, I guess so. We'll see how it goes. But so you also put out this great Speaking of visualizations, you put out this piece that tracked like the first kind of AI real wave of AI assisted disclosures, and you documented some of the metrics with CVE volumes up 563% for Chrome, GitHub advisories up 470% year to date. Walk us through how you separated AI-driven discovery from the early flood of what you would call AI slop too.
Yeah, twofold, right? Which is like mostly the AI discovery thing. I was tracking an Anthropic Glasswing, because like naturally it's like, okay, things that have Anthropic Glasswing or the researchers are clearly associated with AI assisted. There's a larger bucket of AI assisted, which Berkeley has done a really good job at like collecting. There's a little bit of mix in there of like AI products in AI discovered things. Those are two different things, Discovering a vulnerability in OpenClaw is discovering a vulnerability in a piece of software that is associated with AI versus AI being used to assist discovery. And there's a few companies, you can track and look at. ISLE is one of them, AISLE. Glasswing is another. There's a host of others too that are, getting credits and disclosures. But yeah, I'm more or less like, because Glasswing was such a big announcement and they came out like with 250-page papers at launch, I'm like, hey, why is there only one CVE that they disclosed publicly? Oh, and by the way, that CVE was actually discovered by ISLE months before and reported. So like, to me, it's like, hey, this is a lot of marketing hype and a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so I just, naturally was like, hey, I wanna look for myself to see if I can find Anthropic disclosed vulnerabilities to get a better understanding if like, how real this actually is, and help others get visibility, because ultimately like a lot of partners and customers are asking like, hey, can you give us a list of all the vulnerabilities associated with Glasswing? So yeah, naturally I like collecting things, so I just started to search a ton of different places and correlated on who the researchers are, the key terms, companies, domains, email addresses, all that fun stuff, and just like drove through security advisories, CVE lists, GitHub security advisories, links, kernel advisories, all that fun stuff. And so from that, right, I'm like, okay, cool, I found a decent amount of things. So like, it seems like this is real. It's just, there's not a lot of transparency around it. So I was kind of excited that they launched a ledger like 2 weeks ago, because then I'm like, oh, I can cross-reference. I had about 80 vulnerabilities in my database, and the ledger came out and it had 27 vulns. And I'm like, okay, like, I have more things I found than are in the Anthropic ledger, naturally. So like, that's a red flag right there. Like, now some of the ones they disclosed, I didn't have on my list, so I added them to my list. Maybe like 3 to 5 things in there. But yeah, then it's like I want to track this over time, and it's been 2 weeks and they still haven't made a single update to the ledger. So there's all these things, like even things have passed their disclosure date of 90 days and they didn't make them public. Put your money where your mouth is, Anthropic. Like, that's my opinion. And ultimately, like, I know I'm giving Anthropic a hard time, when I'm saying that, but I think they have good intentions. I don't know that they fully understood when they did this the extent of work that goes into coordinated vuln disclosure, the amount of people that don't fix things or even respond to your requests. And so obviously they've enrolled like a bunch of different security companies to partner with them and help with that. But yeah, from a ledger perspective, like, the data kind of shows from my perspective that like finding things actually with AI isn't that difficult. That's not where the bottleneck is. The reality is the bottleneck is downstream once we actually start to validate things and report them. That coordinated vuln disclosure process takes a ton of people effort in order to reach out, confirm, get them to write a fix, test validation, communication back and forth, and then ultimately patch and disclosure. And so I think that's what the project is experiencing. But their coordinated vuln disclosure policy is clearly stating after 90 days, we're going to publish these things, whether they're fixed or not. And so I think like I think there's some real realities of like good intentions. It's going to be interesting to see and track this over time. Yeah, if you hop to the ledger itself, like just to show you some of the things I find interesting, and I haven't published my updated research on this because it's been 2 weeks since the disclosure. But yeah, the if you hit view full ledger, like so if you do the date committed, right? On the left and hit that, like 215, like that's more than 90 days ago. The first 8 of those are more than 90 days ago. So like under your vulnerability disclosure policy, you were supposed to make those public. Like is it, mm, did you give them an extension? Because you do have an extension in your policy, right? But like there's no updates on this ledger. So like to me, it was really important that they gave a marketing update with some information in it. Like, I'm not disputing that this discovery and the information isn't real, but you ultimately got to follow through. And it might just be to give benefit of the doubt that like they're not resourced, so they had to hire some people and they're gonna work on this over time. But for a project that you went out this big swinging, from a disappointment perspective of like being transparent and providing the data to back your claims, I think it's a little lacking. And
Yes.
then even it says like 88 fixed on your thing, which I've been able to find about 88. In here, like why aren't these security advisories actually disclosed in your ledger? There's only 27 things disclosed. So this just continues to be, an aspect. I don't dispute these numbers. I don't dispute that this is real, but like, why aren't you actually being transparent and following through with the things that you actually communicated you're going to do? And they probably will over the next 60 days, on some of it. But I am kind of curious, like, if someone doesn't fix something, are they actually going to follow through on the 90-day disclosure policy and disclose the vuln? I hope
Mhm.
so, but so far the data doesn't show that.
Yeah, it's interesting that, again, you're digging really deep into this stuff, and I think it's a level that most people don't go to. And it's complicated because some of these things have been discussed in the sense of, are they being done from an altruistic perspective to make an impact and help harden the ecosystem, or is it being done from a marketing perspective to drive hype and consumption? And like, and it's
Oh
probably
yeah,
it's
all the
probably yes
above,
to
all
both,
the
right?
above.
Yes, yeah, it's probably yes to both.
Yeah,
So these are complicated topics, and like you're digging deep into the data that makes it really interesting. So I'm curious to see how it'll evolve. And then
yeah,
like again, that diagram we just showed that disclosure aside, remediation is the bottleneck. And
yeah.
this is something that was in DBIR's recent report, for example. It was like a small subset of KEVs are remediated within, I think it's 43 days is the median average, which we know exploitation timelines, versus remediation timelines aren't pretty. Like, what's your perspective on the state of remediation versus discovery disclosure, and like
Yeah.
remediation essentially being the bottleneck, and if anything, AI is kind of just pushing that bottleneck even worse, if that makes sense.
It surfaces more things. Are these things actually impactful? Like those are the questions we're actually trying to answer, right? Is like I wanted to build this list so other people can go use the list to figure out like how impactful are these? Do they make an impact? Is it gonna, help? But yeah, ultimately on the disclosure side, I would say twofold. Like coordinated vuln disclosure, which is typically when you have a vulnerability that isn't public yet, is a bit different than the fixed side, where like there's now a vuln and it shows up in my software tool and it's already discovered, and then it lands on sysakev. Yeah, I think everyone I talk to, from a VM perspective, is just inundated with more and more and more findings, more and more information, more and more challenges. And so, yeah, automation I think is a big part of that. But yeah, you might have a sense of like teams turning over being a cause of this, lack of automation, you just piles and piles of things moving, growing faster and quicker. I think the number of exploited vulnerabilities, it seems to be sustaining more than necessarily increasing. Last I looked, I think like Sysakev is on track for the same amount of vulnerabilities this time as last year. I ran that data maybe a week ago. In
Can I
similarly, I
ask
think
you?
with
Can I ask you a
Vulnercheck,
question there, real quick? Because I know you've pointed out that Sysakev, doesn't necessarily catch all the known exploitation. You all have provided quite a bit of delta there sometimes.
yeah.
So, do you think that the level of exploitation is staying pretty consistent, or is it just that the government program that kind of surfaces this may not be just kind of capturing it all?
Well, yeah, I think twofold. Like if you look at Sys's baseline, you look at then Vulnercheck, which we provide for free, which it's similar. Like the trend is on trend lines that are similar year over year. There could be some limiting factors to that, like ultimately, in order to have an exploited vulnerability, you have to have a way to detect it. That could be a capacity bottleneck from a global perspective, from catching this stuff. But generally speaking, like the things that land on Sysakev are the things that get widely exploited or are widely exploited. And so, yeah, combination, like, yeah, and also, like, we know there was CISA resource issues related to the current administration with funding, right? So there's that aspect as well, but I would just say like, yeah, it's sustaining of the things that you would probably expect to get onto Sysakev. Like today, Cisco just disclosed the new SD-WAN vulnerability. Man, they're having a wild year. Sorry, my camera's going all over the place, but like that if that hasn't already landed on Sysakev, like it probably will in the next couple of hours or by the end of the day, probably like 5 today, just to and then a 3 day fixed deadline. So you got to do it over the weekend. But yeah, I think like the things you would expect generally are getting onto Sysakev in products that are widely adopted and being widely exploited. But it seems to be a similar rate. So threat actors, I think it does kind of show too. Like threat actors have a lot. Like there's a ton of vulnerabilities already for them to target. And so, the other aspect of this is like, do threat actors really need more? And generally, it seems like not. And so, naturally, if we talk about things like the security poverty line, Wendy Nather, and then Adrian Sabrina was talking about this as well, is like ultimately, like, yeah, AI, in a multitude of ways actually increases the security poverty line. Maybe long term it reduces it, but things like token cost, things like Mythos only being available to a subset of people is a great example of increasing the security poverty line. I think the Financial Times has an article which I haven't read, which is about government use of Mythos and offensive security. I think that could make for an interesting read, but like, yeah, ultimately a lot of these tools from a discovery, perspective, offensive perspective, like right now they are only available to people that have been selected and have enough, money. And so that becomes a real reality from a AI perspective. But at the same time, like you can grab other AI tools, and if you have the sophistication to build a harness and know what to do with it, like you that can help people. Um, but yeah, I think those are real realities to consider with like the new availability of AI models, AI tooling that probably aren't being talked a whole lot about.
Yeah, those are great points. I think to your point, like yes, other models, open source, small models, et cetera, can be used, but they require the expertise and the nuance that, to your point, most SMBs and those below the cybersecurity poverty line are not going to have, right? They're not going to have expertise on hand that can just pick up an open weight model and go, do effective harness engineering to find vulnerabilities. And then of course there's,
That will come over time, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, it's like, okay, and how much are these things actually going to cost? It seems like token costs and AI usage is only going to go up. Like these companies aren't profitable in making money. And we've already seen this shift from like, hey, $200 a month to now like as much as you want to spend a month based on your usage.
Consumption-based pricing is an interesting topic right now, and especially
Yeah.
because it was, early on, it felt like the first half of this year, it was just like, well, just use AI. In cyber, it was like, just use AI for AI SOC, AI AppSec, AI find vulns, AI all the things. And now it's like, well, there's a cost associated with that, and it's consumption based. And that is like, oh, well, maybe we can't just use the latest, greatest model for all the things. And like cybersecurity budgets are not infinite, right? So it's also circular in the sense that like AI creates problems, right? The threat landscape, the attack of the attacker volume and velocity, the number of findings, et cetera, is all being driven by AI. And the solution, of course, to that is more AI, which means you have to spend more on AI to kind of address these things. So
I think there's a real economic dynamic here where it's like we're creating demand, like we're making money creating demand, and then we're making money solving demand. And I think there was like a token circle aspect with Adrian's article of like, oh yeah, we just created this circular workflow of tokens cost here, tokens cost here, token cost here, token cost here.
yeah, I
And
mean,
so
I can't hate on them. It's a great business
no,
model,
I
and
know, yeah, I'm not either, but I think that dynamic of like, okay, all of a sudden, like, hey, there's a problem because of AI. You're gonna pay us to identify the problem, and then you're gonna pay us to fix the problem, and then you're gonna, that the loop aspect there is like rather interesting. And yeah, that I think that was Glasswing's announcement this week. They basically came out with an announcement with not much of any updates other than, hey, you can now use us to fix all your stuff that we found.
yeah.
And so that's pretty telling of a marketing campaign as well, which is pretty fun.
So you asked a couple last questions for you as we wrap up here. Earlier, you mentioned this 90-day disclosure timeline, which is kind of an industry standard. Like, I know
Yeah.
you all at Vulnercheck have disclosed something like 1,600 or more vulnerabilities across hundreds of open source projects, and only a small fraction of those have been patched, which seems similar to what we saw from that Glasswing diagram that we looked at, right? Given that reality of the remediation bottleneck. And that now AI can generate disclosures at scale. Does that 90-day disclosure model still hold up, or does it have to change when exploitation is already happening in the wild? How do you think of that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And yeah, the numbers, we've issued lots of CVEs, and then there's a subset of things we do issue a CVE for, and things that are coordinated vuln disclosure. So any researcher, any person can come to us and say, hey, I found this vulnerability, I need a CVE, or hey, I found this vulnerability, I don't want to go through the coordinated vuln disclosure process with a vendor, maybe for reasons, multitude of reasons. Like they don't want the vendor to know that they're reporting this vuln. They don't want to deal with the customer interaction side of like reporting a vulnerability. They don't know how. Like there's many different reasons why. They come to us rather than directly to a vendor. Maybe they don't even know how to report to the vendor because there's no information. So our team will take that and run with that. My take is like the 90-day disclosure window makes a lot of sense. Could it be shorter? Does it need to be shorter? Maybe. I think more importantly is giving the vendor an opportunity to fix something and get it out. Definitely from an exploitation perspective, like if there's signs that someone is using a vulnerability, definitely that's going to increase the priority in getting things done. I think on the disclosure side, we have 120 days. And some of that's, it's like, okay, yeah, we don't give exceptions. Like we don't give exceptions. It's 120 days. So we're more than standard, right? But we don't make any exceptions because making those exceptions is what kills you. From a volume velocity perspective, and doing this type of work, then I have to track exceptions, run all that stuff down. But yeah, generally speaking, I think like, yes, the software organizations need to move faster, quicker. There's a value in just fixing and disclosing faster, quicker. And then, yeah, another dynamic too is disclosure. Like a lot of people think like responsible is a term that's been used by Microsoft and other vendors. Vulnerability disclosure or responsible reporting is essentially like, oh, security researcher, you give this to me and then it's mine and I do whatever I want. And oh, by the way, I made you sign a legal agreement, so you can't say anything about it. So I think there's that dynamic as well that comes into play, that we're seeing a little bit right now play out with frustrated security researchers. And so naturally, like when people report to us, we are committed to disclosure, whether the vendor is going to disclose or not, because that's the essentially the right thing to do. So generally, what we're experiencing on the CVD side, coordinated vulnerability disclosure, is usually around 45 to 48 days on average. A fix in public disclosure happens, which to me seems pretty reasonable. And so I think, like from a benchmark perspective, yeah, maybe maybe the 90 days should change down to 60. I think when we're talking about open source software, the reality is there's commits all over the place that show the vulnerability anyway. And so open source, like, I'm not saying don't do coordinated vulnerability disclosure, but once you start making changes to your code to fix a vulnerability, like it's public. It was already public anyway, the vulnerability. So, yeah, I think different dynamics from like a perspective of whether this is open source or closed source, you can take into consideration as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess last question for you. You've been watching the dynamic of vulnerability management, disclosure, discovery, exploitation, all these things so closely among the industry. One of the people watching it the most closely and tracking it. Looking ahead a couple years here, like if discovery and exploitation are both becoming, and we kind of joked about this with the circular logic, becoming compute problems, right? While the public
Yeah.
infrastructure meant to kind of coordinate all of it, like NVD and so on, remains underfunded and the backlogs are problematic. What worries you the most, and kind of where do you think things need to go to try to improve this? And I know it's a complicated question, but just some high
Yeah.
level thoughts.
I think things have to get worse and there has to be more pain in order for this to get fixed. Ultimately, what we're talking about is vendors and products that have flaws and defects, right? And like their vulnerabilities. And that is ultimately the responsibility of the software supplier, vendor, product, open source project, maintainers. But I think that's a real reality. And so that means like you have to take things more serious. You might have to rewrite things from a code base perspective. You should be playing with AI models and running them against your product from a security perspective, but it's also it's going to become a lot more harder for vendors to hide vulnerabilities like they often try. Often they don't disclose and then someone goes and reverse engineers a patch and boom, hey, here's the vulnerabilities they didn't disclose or publish. And I mean, some of the reasons why that's important is number one, that's an indicator for defenders to fix, but also that's often what's used to build detection capabilities from a defensive perspective. So I think a lot of times, people forget that. But yeah, I mean, I think we're going to go through a phase in time here, especially with AI, where like there's just incredible amount of uncertainty, and hopefully we come out the other side where things are getting better, more robust, and security is better. But I think that's going to be uh, it's going to take some time to flush out. And I don't know. I'll keep on watching and tracking and providing any insights that where I can help.
Yeah.
Is certainly my thought.
Yeah, I appreciate, like I said, you're one of the top folks I follow, and I unfortunately agree with you. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it's going to have to. It's an age-old discussion that we've had with people like Casey Ellis and Wendy Nather and others, and you and I. It's like either the market incentives have to suddenly appear, right, for people to
Yeah.
take this seriously, or there has to be regulatory changes, or I should say, because
Yeah.
it could be both, right?
Yeah, there is some good things. Like I think from I don't remember what group it was, but it was more like financial analysts that reported like the number one risk concern from like a CFO perspective is cyber now. All these other things have dropped on the radar from a risk perspective, and that's it. So, but that doesn't mean like just because that's a top priority doesn't mean like the right actions are taken and things get better. Like
Just
with
on that note,
some of these products, like they just need to be deprecated.
I was gonna say that I could see that being a perverse incentive in a way because say cyber is a top priority for the CFO, which means that security leaders and teams are likely to get more budget, which makes security vendors salivate at the idea of selling more products, not necessarily solving
Sure.
problems. So it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's like such a weird ecosystem that we exist in,
Oh, dude.
and
Tech. I've done it long enough to like, watch the game being played, and yeah, I mean, ultimately, organizations have to make money, not just on the cyber side, right? Like all software organizations, and so yeah, the hope is like, they actually take action to help, build more secure products over time, but that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. There's a lot of software you got to consider, like industrial control systems, or you know, um, retail systems or other things where like they serve a purpose and security is not the primary use case. And so I think it's going to take a long time, for some of these technologies to get to where they need to be from a security perspective.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Unfortunately, I should say, I guess. But Pat, thanks so much for jumping on, man. I learned so much from our talks, and please keep up the great research visualizations, and I'll keep sharing them on my end. And appreciate you joining me again.
Cool. Love it, man. Thanks for the
Yeah,
collaboration.
absolutely. Take care.